This video is going to go over cellular respiration. If you need to reference your textbook, it is in Chapter 9 of your biology textbook. So the first thing you need to understand is that cellular respiration is not breathing. That's one of the number one misconceptions that students have. This is a process that is happening in your cells, hence why it is called cellular respiration. And as you are doing cellular respiration, your body is actually getting out, so that's why it says harvesting, chemical energy. So you are actually getting the energy out of the foods that you eat. And that is the main function of cellular respiration. So that's the first thing you need to write down in your notes. The main function of cellular respiration is to actually get the energy out of the food that you eat. So the definition of cellular respiration is that process of extracting the stored energy from the glucose. So extracting stored energy from glucose. Now keep in mind, glucose for you and I is the food that we eat, and for plants, they make that glucose during the process of photosynthesis. And so that food cannot be used as energy yet. And so what every living thing has to do is they need to extract that energy, and they're going to store it in the form of ATP. And ATP is basically like the batteries for your cells. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate, and so the adenosine triphosphate, the ATP, is what is going to basically run the cells and give your cells the energy. So here we can see the overall equation for the process of cellular respiration. So our reactants are over here on the left-hand side. Our reactants going in are C6H12O6, and that is the glucose, either the glucose that you eat for us or another organism, or the glucose that is made during the process of photosynthesis, such as in plants. The other material that is needed is oxygen. And we're going to talk about cellular respiration can actually be done without oxygen. It's a different kind of cellular respiration, but most of the time our cells are doing it with oxygen. The products then, so we have our arrow sign here that shows us that we are making products in this overall chemical equation. And our products then are going to be carbon dioxide, which for you and I, we breathe out. Now, since all organisms are doing this process, plants also release carbon dioxide because they also are doing cellular respiration and photosynthesis. There is also going to be the product of water. So there are 6 water molecules that are released. And then the energy here is actually going to be in the form that I talked about on the last side, which is ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And the adenosine triphosphate, this product right here, is the product that your body needs. The other 2 products of the process, carbon dioxide and water, these 2 products are being given off as waste products. Now, your body will keep some of the water in order to do other chemical processes, but it is a waste product. Most of cellular respiration is controlled by enzymes, which we covered last unit, and we talked about enzymes as one of those macromolecules that are proteins. So this is why whenever you get a fever, you need to make sure that you're very careful, because if you remember from last unit, enzymes can be denatured or lose their shape due to temperature. And if they lose their shape and your enzymes cannot control the process of cellular respiration, this entire process here to get energy for your body is not going to be able to occur. There are actually 2 different types of cellular respiration. Aerobic respiration, which is what we do the majority of the time, and anaerobic respiration. So I'm going to talk about the difference between aerobic respiration and anaerobic respiration. We're going to talk about anaerobes first. So anaerobes are any sort of organism that uses the anaerobic respiration pathway. So most anaerobes are going to be bacteria, but not all of them. There are anaerobic processes that are done by other organisms. And with anaerobic respiration, this process, we see respiration as needing the material of oxygen as a reactant. But when an organism does anaerobic respiration, it does not require oxygen. So that's anaerobic respiration. It does not require oxygen as a reactant. The other type of respiration is aerobic respiration. So aerobes are organisms that use the aerobic respiration pathway. Most of the time you are doing the process of aerobic respiration, and that means that it is going to require oxygen. Now there are times when you do anaerobic respiration, and we're going to talk about the different kinds of anaerobic respiration and how they're different from aerobic respiration, which does require oxygen. So the key here is to remember the difference between anaerobic and aerobic. Aerobic requires the reactant of oxygen. Anaerobic does not require oxygen. With anaerobic respiration, it does not require oxygen. And the two most common forms of anaerobic respiration that we are going to talk about are alcoholic fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. Regardless of which process of respiration the organism is doing, aerobic or anaerobic, all living things go through the first stage of respiration, which is called glycolysis. And this process actually takes place in the cytoplasm. The rest of the process of cellular respiration is going to happen in the organelle called the mitochondria. But the first step, no matter whether you're going through anaerobic or aerobic, is called glycolysis and happens in the cytoplasm. What is glycolysis? Glyco means glucose or sugar, so you can kind of see the word glucose in glycolysis. And the word lysis means to split. And so what's happening in the process of glycolysis is we are actually breaking apart the glucose. So let's talk first about the process of alcoholic fermentation. This kind of anaerobic respiration is carried out by yeast and some other funguses. So you can see in the images here we have two processes. Alcoholic fermentation is going to make alcohols. So the process of making wines or the process of making beers and hard alcohols are going to use yeast, which is a kind of fungus, to do anaerobic respiration, and it results in alcoholic fermentation as the kind of anaerobic respiration that's being done. With this, we have alcohol as a product, and it is actually poisonous to the yeast that is carrying it out, but there's no oxygen available, and the yeast needs energy. And so it needs the energy, and it's lacking the oxygen. It's going to do what it needs to get that oxygen, or to get that energy, so it goes to the process of alcoholic fermentation. So in alcoholic fermentation, we're only going to use that very first step of glycolysis, and again, no oxygen is required as a reactant. But it is going to produce some energy when that oxygen is not available. It's not going to produce as much energy as aerobic respiration, but when needed, it's going to do anaerobic respiration. So this is an example of anaerobic respiration, which does not require oxygen. So this also explains alcohol is poisonous to cells, and so the content of materials that contain alcohol, such as wine, can't actually have an alcohol content greater than 12 to 14 because that alcohol is actually toxic and it's going to kill the organism of yeast at high concentrations. So it only can produce a certain percentage of alcohol before these cells that are making the alcohol are killed. There's a couple of different ways that we use alcoholic fermentation. Fermentation that occurs in cheese are going to make the holes in Swiss cheese, and it's because of bubbles of carbon dioxide that are given off during that process of fermentation. So we use fermentation in the alcohol industry as well as in the baking industry. So you do not do alcoholic fermentation, you do a process of lactic acid fermentation, and it works very similarly. It does not require oxygen, and it's only going to do the very first step of glycolysis happening in the cytoplasm, where it's going to split the glucose apart. It does produce ATP, which is energy for your cells, but not as much as aerobic respiration. So lactic acid fermentation, that is going to be an anaerobic process as well, and this is what your muscle cells do when they do not have enough oxygen available to do aerobic respiration. So this process is carried out by human muscle cells when there is not enough oxygen available. But just like alcohol, lactic acid is a toxin to your cells, and it's going to cause fatigue, soreness, and stiffness in your muscles. And so this is why you want to stretch after a workout to push that lactic acid into your blood system so that your body can process and get rid of that toxin. Aerobic respiration, on the other hand, is going to require oxygen. Now, aerobic respiration is still going to start with that process of glycolysis that is going to happen out in the cytoplasm, but the process of aerobic respiration is going to continue in the mitochondria. And we actually get more energy from the aerobic process than we do from the anaerobic process. So this is why our bodies are going to rely on the aerobic respiration rather than the anaerobic, because we get more energy from the aerobic process happening in our mitochondria. Key things to keep in mind when comparing aerobic and anaerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration is going to require the mitochondria and oxygen, and actually has 3 phases to the process, but you don't need to memorize all 3 processes. Anaerobic respiration is not going to require oxygen and consists of only one phase happening in the cytoplasm called glycolysis.